6 women vanished from Chillicothe, Ohio within 18 months, and not one case has ever been fully solved. The town sits in the Scioto River Valley, where Appalachian poverty and the opioid crisis had already made life precarious for so many residents. Charlotte Trego disappeared first, then Tameka Lynch, then 4 more women whose names the national news barely bothered to learn. Investigators found patterns that pointed somewhere dark, but every lead seemed to dissolve before it could become an answer. What kind of town watches 6 of its own disappear and still cannot say exactly why? Chillicothe is the kind of place that holds its history like a bruise. Old capital of Ohio, older still in its wounds. Scioto cuts through the valley like a boundary between the world that forgot this town and the one still living inside it. By 2014, the opioid crisis hadn't just arrived here. It had settled in, taken a room, and started collecting names. These 6 women moved through that world every day, known to their families, known to their streets, known to everyone except the systems designed to protect them. Before they were missing persons, they were people. And that distinction is exactly what this town failed to hold on to. Charlotte Trego was 37 years old, a mother, and a woman who knew the streets of Chillicothe the way most people know their own kitchen. She'd struggled with addiction, which in Ross County in 2014 meant she was already half invisible to the people who were supposed to be watching. She was last seen in May of that year, somewhere near the Scioto River corridor where so many of these stories would eventually converge. No dramatic last phone call, no witnessed confrontation, just a woman who was there one day and simply wasn't the next. Her family reported her missing, and the response they got back felt like a shrug dressed in paperwork. What does it say about a system when a mother vanishes and the first instinct of that system is to wait and see? Charlotte wasn't a statistic yet. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, a person with a name that deserved more than a case number filed in a drawer. And she was only the first. Charlotte's disappearance didn't close a chapter. It opened a door that wouldn't shut. Tameka Lynch vanished in May of 2014, just weeks after Charlotte, last seen near the same streets on the south side of town. Wanda Lemons disappeared October 2014, a mother of 6 who told people she was afraid, and then stopped telling anyone anything. Shasta Himelrick was gone. December 2014, her name added to a list that Chillicothe was only beginning to understand it was keeping. Tiffany Sayre disappeared in early 2015, and by then, the women who knew her had already learned not to be surprised. Kimberly Claytor was the 6th, and when her name circulated through town, something shifted. The fear stopped being background noise and became the only sound. These weren't strangers to each other, and they weren't strangers to the same corners, same struggles, the same invisible edges of a town that looked away. 5 women in 18 months, all from the same few square miles of southern Ohio, all poor, all vulnerable, all gone. The police called the cases unrelated, but the mothers of Chillicothe were already asking the question that no official answer could quiet. 6 women, and the map kept folding back on itself in the same small corner of Ross County. They all moved through overlapping social circles, the same streets, the same desperate economy that had hollowed out Chillicothe for decades. Most of them knew each other, or knew someone who knew someone, which in a town this size is almost the same thing. Investigators found a tighter web than that, though. Shared acquaintances, shared suppliers, shared stretches of road where the last confirmed sightings clustered. The geography wasn't random, and neither were the circumstances. Women in crisis, women whose absence could be explained away before anyone started asking hard questions. That explanation, that they'd simply moved on or relapsed or run, is exactly what delayed the reckoning. When journalists started laying the timelines side by side, the spacing between disappearances looked less like coincidence and more like rhythm. But a pattern that points everywhere points nowhere, and every lead investigators chased seemed to dissolve just before it hardened into something a prosecutor could use. Investigators floated a serial killer theory almost immediately, and for a moment it felt like the shape of an answer. A single predator, hunting along the Scioto River corridor, targeting women whose lives made them easy to isolate and hard to track. The FBI came in, task forces formed, and the machinery of a major investigation began turning in Ross County. But the serial killer theory required a suspect, and every name that surfaced seemed to dissolve under scrutiny before charges could follow. One man was questioned repeatedly, his name circulating through the community like a rumor that refused to die, yet no arrest ever came. Investigators also pursued the possibility that multiple perpetrators were involved, which meant no single thread to pull and no clean case to build. Each lead opened into another corridor of uncertainty, and the task force eventually went quiet in ways that felt less like resolution and more like retreat. The women shared a world that law enforcement had always treated as someone else's problem, and you have to wonder whether that history shaped how hard anyone was willing to push. When the people who vanish are already invisible, the search has a way of losing urgency before it ever finds the truth. There's a question that runs underneath every missing persons case, and it rarely gets asked out loud. Who decides that a disappearance is worth chasing? And what does that decision say about the rest of us? When Charlotte, Tameka, Wanda, Shasta, Tiffany, and Timberly went missing, the national press mostly looked the other way. They were poor women from a struggling Appalachian town, and several of them were fighting addiction, which made it easy for the story to be filed under a different, quieter category. Investigators later faced pointed questions about whether early reports were treated as runaways rather than emergencies, whether the urgency matched what a different set of victims might have received. Criminologists have a name for this pattern, the missing white woman syndrome, but the truth it describes is older and uglier than any academic label. The women of Chillicothe weren't invisible because the town failed to love them. They were invisible to the systems that were supposed to protect them. And that invisibility may have cost them everything. What a community carries after that kind of failure doesn't heal quietly. Chillicothe didn't collapse after 2015. It just learned to carry the weight differently. The murals went up, the vigils were held, and then the town went quiet. In the way that only unresolved grief can make a place go quiet. Families still drive the same streets where their daughters were last seen, scanning faces out of habit they can't break. The task force that once promised answers was quietly dissolved, its files handed off and its urgency absorbed into bureaucratic silence. Women in Chillicothe's poorest neighborhoods still tell you they watch their backs, that nothing has fundamentally changed for people like them. The shelters are still underfunded, the addiction crisis still burns, and the systems that failed these 6 women remain largely intact. A few cases carry cold case status now, which is the official way of saying nobody is actively looking. So you have to ask, what does a town owe the women it couldn't protect? And what does it mean when the answer is still nothing? Charlotte Trego vanished in May 2014, and no one has ever been charged with anything connected to her disappearance. Tameka Lynch disappeared that same summer, her case still open, her family still waiting for a phone call that hasn't come. Wanda Lemons went missing in October 2014, and the circumstances around her disappearance remain officially unexplained. Shasta Himelrick disappeared in the winter, found dead. The full truth of what happened to her, buried somewhere, no investigator has reached. Tiffany Sayre vanished in the spring of 2015, and the silence around her case is the kind that feels deliberate. Claytor disappeared last, and like the others, she left behind people who deserved answers Chillicothe never gave them. 6 women, 6 open wounds in a town that learned to live with the bleeding. Say their names because the systems that failed them never said them loudly enough.